Alright, so hopefully you've gotten through all the videos on this channel so far and you're going, well, what's next, bro? You should have a lot of practice you need to work on. I mean, we started out in theory and we talked about all the basics of theory. We looked at the piano and we looked at, various pieces of paper and pictures that I have that most of them you can get and download on Doc's Music Theory Lab, or you can contact me on here and ask me about it. We went through and we talked about basic components of notes and tones and frequencies. We talked about, what the importance of frequency is for when you start composing. Sometimes that may not be real obvious on the soft, in notation, but when you see a note here. A very simple concept to understand as you're composing is that one note basically has a whole lot of harmonic and frequency content in it, and that can vary depending on the instrument. So, and all those frequencies that are inside of that one note, are going to be, integral to the part of the composition, how it sounds, for texturing it. And the first part of the series, or the first videos on this channel, make that very obvious, because I use those for the stuff I'm teaching in audio engineering, so that they could relate that very easily to what's going on in the area of acoustics, the sound of science. So, we've addressed all the issues, all the basic issues of theory. And when we got done with that, we had a long talk about final thoughts on theory, at the first series of music theory. And then after we got done talking about that, we went through, at the end of that series, we went through basic notation, a couple videos on basic notation. And then we had a couple videos on final thoughts on music theory that should have been hopefully very enlightening to you about what's happening, what advanced theory can mean. And then we went on and we talked about actual advanced theory concepts. Some of the advanced theory concepts, I tried to keep it as layman terms as possible so that it wasn't really too scientific and it wasn't real, in university kind of setting, and trying to put it in as layman of terms as possible so that the simple concepts you can relate very easily to. The more you get into it and the deeper you get into it, the more I don't want to say you have to, but the deeper you get into it, the more chance you're going to start getting into more theoretical tools. You will become much more theoretical in working with your software and your notation and some of the terms you may be using when you're talking about theory or constructing theoretical concepts, using components of theory to build and weave orchestrations or compositions. And that just comes from experience. The more experience you get and the more familiar you are with it, the deeper you're going to dig, and the more theoretical some of the things you do will become. And I know that might sound kind of fuzzy. I hope it doesn't, because that's the way I found it. Because when I first started it, it was like I didn't know. And then as I learned, I tried to apply that, but sometimes I just couldn't, because I didn't have the knowledge to do that. And then as my knowledge grew, then I ran into some issues where I would get this tug and pull thing of between feeling and theory. And I got lost in that for a while until I realized that basically the all music theory was based on, hundreds of years of people trying to make some type of mathematical formula or some type of formulas to try to build basic building blocks to work from. So that, at least your feelings, if you wandered off somewhere, because you were feeling a certain chord sounded good, or a certain progression sounded good, or a change of key, or something like that, that you can always, you could eventually somehow land on your feet and get, if you've changed key, to land somewhere so that you have a basic structure to work within again that sounds good historically, that people have tried over and over again. And that can be very true. Sometimes it may feel confining, but that's not the point of it. The purpose is of music theory isn't to confine you, it's to give you something to stand on. It's like, well, some music theory, it's very strict in some compositions, but a lot of times it's just something to stand on. There's all those building blocks for you to put together to climb up on to see where you might want to go, to have some type of foundation. And we talked about advanced theory. When you get into really advanced theory, that's the concept. That's the wall that you have to break through, that, to understand that it's the foundation for you to work from. You might get into some really heavy jazz or experimental music, or like, music or movie film score kind of productions, to where it's just going all over the place. You're changing key, you're changing type of music, you're going all over the place, and there is no theory for that. I mean, there just isn't. For some of the concepts that are happening, there's a lot of tried methods that people have used historically. But you can study that until the day you're dead and never ever pick up an instrument ever. I'm telling you, I know so. So, you can go so far where how much you want, how deep you want to get into that. Or you can make it a lifelong study, that you're always studying a little bit from some period in time or something else to explore. We've talked a little bit about it. I've watched some videos of people exploring, little passages from Beethoven, that were like 3 hours, with professors that have been in school for 20 years, talking about this 4-note passage and what that meant, and I'm like going, oh, bro, I don't know, dude, and it's like, how deep you want to get. So we covered just about everything. We started out with a basic theory, and we tried to get it is trying to keep it as simple as possible without getting too complex. And we took out the piano and we used the keyboard to try to understand our basic theory. Things like this keys and the scales that go with them, that we use the notes and the tones for, and borrowed chords, borrowed notes, or non-tonal chords and non-tonal notes that are used. We talked about progressions. We talked about the simple concepts of what those are. We talked about a whole lot of things. And most of the things we talked about, the very difficult thing to get at this point, that now that you're able to view the theory on your piano, you're able to view the theory hopefully soon enough in your mind, and maybe be able to starting to hear the theory and what's happening, and you're able to visualize it on the staff now. So you can look on the staff and visualize notes and harmony, and you can visualize progressions and chords, and you can visualize different types of articulations. You can visualize space and time visually, to where you can actually see space and time and work with space and time, either with your special tool that is $39.95 at birth, that you never have to pay for. So, that you should be at a point now to where you should be very much experimenting with what we've talked about, and working with it and learning what all that is. But those are the basic tools. There's a lot of tools that some people get on me and say, well, bro, you didn't talk about a whole lot of things. Well, there's some things I didn't, because I basically was looking at the staff as a tool to visualize the theory on. When you start composing and you start getting into some things, and you start looking at repeats and codas, and all kinds of things like that, codas and segnos, and some of the other notation things that we talked about, some of those things are going to take on a new meaning, and I'm hoping that I covered most of those things well enough in the videos in this series, while working on the actual staff and in the notation software, and the 2 videos at the end of this series of music theory at the beginning of this channel. There should be Music Theory 11 and Music Theory 12. Then I talked about almost all of those concepts and the notations and what those things mean fairly thoroughly. And you might need to just review it and go through it. But that way now, not only do you have those things, the next step for you is, I don't know that you're playing the B-flat clarinet, bro. I just don't. So if you're studying theory and you play the clarinet, well, I really didn't get into the clarinet, bro, but I also didn't get into all these other instruments, and many, many, many more from all over the planet, and so That's something you kind of got to work through on your own. But the basic concepts of theory are the same with just about any instrument. All if it's Western music, and this is the theory for the most part that we're dealing with. So I'm hoping at this point that we've gotten to a point that now you have a couple few good tools to work with to formulate your theory, to work out your theory, to experiment on your theory, and to experiment with your abilities inside of your theory and different concepts in your theory to experiment in and explore. And we talked about tons of advanced theory concepts so that when you're dealing with things, people, I hear a lot of times, some of the biggest concepts I hear are people talk about progressions. And they'll be really wanting to know about why that you would put these chords in sequence or these notes in sequence, and it's like, well, we talked about that. It's like, well, that chord progression is a chord progression that's a tonal progression, or it's maybe not. It's something that happens in some type of genre. And melody, I mean, obviously, melody is working on the foundation of the chord structure, trying to create harmonies as it moves along. And, I get a lot of questions about that. And that, for the most part, either takes study and then normally a little bit of both, looking up progressions and melodies that follow progressions in certain types of genres and things like that, because that can be very confusing when you're looking at a score like this and you're going, well, I just don't see that, bro. And I'm like going, well, that's not a shock, bro. I mean, we talked about space and time, so at this one moment in time, all along here, all those notes at that one moment in time are forming some type of harmony. I mean, they just are. That's like one big long chord. You know what I'm saying? And they're using different instruments with different textures of the way they sound and different tones to create harmonies and textures in time. And that's a very simple concept to get through your head. And where they're going with that, does that make sense? And we talked about most of those concepts. So I think the biggest thing we need to talk about right now is we need to talk about what you're going to want to do. I really suggest at this point that you really go through and watch all the videos on this channel again and really make sure you're really familiar with all the theoretical concepts we talked about, all of the notation concepts we talked about, what that means, so that you are fairly knowledgeable and have a pretty good understanding of theory itself, and you also have an understanding of the keyboard to voice your theory, the staff to visualize your theory, and the staff to understand your theory is eventually going to end up somewhere in space and time. In time. Does that make sense? And being able to understand those rhythmic concepts and as simply as possible. I mean, I try to tell you to keep it as simple as possible unless it has to get complex, because the more complex you let it get, well, it's going to get as complex as you want, and you just don't want to go there if you don't have to. Keep it simple, stupid. And that's very derogatory, but it can be very true. And I tell myself that, keep it simple, stupid, unless you have to, which sometimes I do. I'd be like, no, it's just not going to work real simple there. I mean, it's just not. It's going to have to be complicated, because to get done what I want, it's a very complicated construction to do that. So, I'm doing construction anytime I'm doing music anyway. So that's and plus I did construction before I did music, so those concepts are very easy for me to understand. So at this point, that I really think you should go through and review those. We've talked about all the concepts we talked about. The only last piece of advice I would tell you is I would tell you to get on Wikipedia and look up notation on Wikipedia and maybe some other site, and really read about it and understand everything it's telling you there. It might take you a day or two in the evening or something like that to really go through it, and it's going to maybe address some issues we didn't talk about that may not be real pertinent to you right now, or maybe, how do I say that? I'm not even going to say that because that's not correct. That would be a very good step. And the next step, I would say, to go through your notation software, even if you have something like MuseScore, and really familiarize yourself with everything that's in there, what it's trying to explain to you, because it may enlighten you into some other things as far as what can happen with your theory and what can happen in your notation, rhythmically in time and theoretically. So take a look at that, because that can just open up some doors. You might just come across something and go, whoa, bro, what is that? And Google it and go, well, what's going on there? Well, that's pretty dang cool, bro. I'm gonna have to remember that. What is that? What can I? How can I use that? Or that's another tool that I have that can set off to the side that I can pull out. Oh, I got this cool screwdriver, dude. You look what this does. Yeah, dude. All right, because I love tools, bro. I mean, I just love tools, software tools, any kind of dang tool. I just love tools. So those are tools. Does that make sense? And I really suggest you get this Musician 5 and practice with it. There's other ones. That's a pretty good one, not too expensive. And, that's where I think you should go. We're going to talk about some other theory. And I think in the next video, we're just going to kind of review some advanced theory, because basically, when we're talking about advanced theory, the basic concepts can be very complicated. But trying to build complicated concepts and tapestries from the simple concepts that music theory and notation and space and time are, that's the biggest thing to get through your head. Because if you can do that, making a brick isn't that hard. Does that make sense? And if you can make one brick, you can make the Taj Mahal. All right, and it's that simple. There's other components that were put together to build that thing, but there's basic components for building, and if you can get to the basic components laid out, you can build just about anything. Does that make sense? It might look huge, but, and it might look monstrous and complicated beyond belief, but if you can understand the basic concepts, one brick at a time, one note at a time, one moment in time at a time, and you can build huge, complex structures, and very complex complexities from the theory, from one building block of theory at a time, interwoven together to build huge complexities, of musical theoretical structures that you've woven together to create and build something, something that is part theory, part feeling, that's interwoven to create something really cool. And that's a very simple concept to understand. And we've talked about most of those. Most of the biggest things, one big thing that you're going to come into with music theory is experience. Here's a very simple example. This is a transition area right here. And this guy on this measure, this song's flowing along right here, and then it kind of ends here, and then this right here is like a transition going to this next part. Does that make sense? Because he kind of hears it in his head where he's going to go, so he's got to build this transition that might be 2 or 3 chords, or 4 or 5 chords. It might be a measure, 2 measures, 3, 4 measures. It might be 8 measures going into going somewhere else, moving along to somewhere else. Those kind of concepts come with time, and they can be very simple concepts, but can seem very difficult and very, hard to get a grasp on with no understanding of what that means. Because basically, you're either using the scale and the key to move around in, or you've left the scale and key and you're using other chords and tones that aren't in that key to move somewhere else, or to do a circle and come out of it for a minute and then come back into it. But you left it at the C chord in the key of C, and you've left the key for a minute, and you're doing these few chords that are not even in key, and coming back to the D chord that that is a D minor in the key of C. Those kind of concepts, there's multitudes of them, and there's multitudes of ways to do that theoretically, and just fly by night. You just took flight, and you just go, well, I like this augmented chord and then this diminished chord, and I don't know where I'm going, bro. I just jumped right off the house and started flying. And that can be very true, and that sounds very untheoretical, but it can be very true. And there's a lot of times that just happens. Or you start going somewhere and then you find yourself there, and you find yourself at this augmented chord going, well, what do I do now? And it's like, well, you start working from the tones in the augmented chord. One of those tones is going to want to move some direction, and that's normally a really good starting point. That way, if I've got like landed on this augmented chord for some reason, I was feeling an augmented chord right there. It sounded cool, and I look at all the notes in an augmented chord, and one of them want to move either down or up in some direction. Does that make sense? And move in some way in time. Does that make sense? And that complex concept is very simple. Jumping point, to the next chord and the next, feeling, or, the next moment in time while you're constructing. So, I hope that you enjoyed this series so far. And in the next video, it might be a little bit of repetition of this stuff, but we've talked about all the theory. You've got some basic tools now to visualize your theory and to work out your theory. You understand the basic concepts of the tones, the keys, the scales, and things like that to work out what's going on. And we've talked about more. We've talked about some advanced concepts as far as music theory. And most of it, when we've talked about space and time, and we've covered most of it pretty well to where the basics you should have a pretty good understanding of by now. And you may want to go through all the videos and review, watch them a couple times if you're really into the theory to really understand what's going on and let it sink in. When you're studying, you go to college to study music theory. I mean, they might be studying years, bro, and it's a lot of it's repetition. It's like, well, they may not look that way, but basically, I want you to watch all the videos on this channel 10 times. Over the next, 2 years. You know what I'm saying? And, that sounds funny, but basically a lot of times that's what it boils down to, and you're just reviewing and going through it again and again until it becomes second nature to you so that you really have a good grasp on what's happening there. So I don't dissuade you from that at all. So I hope you enjoyed the series so far. Peace, hope, love. I'll see you in the next video when we tackle advanced theory a little bit more. Just fly by night. Peace, hope, love.